Hello and welcome to the Whole Counsel of God Bible Study Book Club thing. Um, Tonight we're going to be talking about different Bible versions. Which Bible should I read? I don't know why. I'm just really excited for this particular book club session. I feel like it's going to be really fun. But last time we talked about textual criticism and how and why we do textual criticism. We talked about, I don't know what's up with that. Anyway, we talked about why textual variants aren't an issue, and we talked about how the amazing way in which the New Testament has been preserved for us. So tonight, we're going to be talking about with how with how important the Bible is, with now that we've discussed the importance of the text, how we got the text, all these things. Now we're going to be talking about how to choose what translation you're reading from. I'm going to be using English translations as examples because we speak English. But that said, I think the principles that we're discussing could be used to discuss any language, really. Um, so there you go. Before I get into it, I wanted to say that next week I will not be able to be here because next week my wife and I have our anniversary. So we're going to be out of town, so we'll miss that week. I hope that y'all can find some good YouTube videos to watch or something, but um, I'll miss everybody, but I'll also be having fun. Anyway, so before we get too far into it, I would say a great quote from Dr. Jeannie Constantinou is, she said, "Which Bible is the best Bible? Well, the best Bible is the one that you'll read." So I would agree with that. There's definitely some truth in that. The Bible is so important, and reading the Bible is so important to the Orthodox Christian that, ultimately we're going to be discussing a lot of principles, and I am going to discuss some reasons why there are certain, I guess, versions of the Bible or really paraphrases of the Bible that are probably not the best and that you probably won't benefit from as much and shouldn't use. But with that said, the general rule is that if a Bible is a real Bible translation, then it's still the Bible. And so I don't want anything I say tonight to give the impression that, like, oh, if my Bible is the Holman Bible, then it's inferior to the Orthodox Study Bible. No, read the Holman Bible if that's what you have. For the first couple of years that I was Orthodox, I used the Holman translation of the Bible in my daily devotions because I just had a very prized Holman Bible that had been a gift from my wife, and I really loved it. And then eventually, my wife got me an Orthodox Study Bible, and I switched to using that one very exclusively, very quickly. But the point is, the best Bible that you can use is the one that you will use. So now that said, why do we need Bible translations, right? Like, wouldn't it be better if we could all just read the Bible in the original languages? Or if we could all read it in Greek? And, the answer is obviously, yeah, that would be better. But the thing is that, reading most people are not going to master the biblical languages. They're not going to, go and get a master's degree and be fluent in Koine Greek so that they can understand the Bible. And frankly, even most clergy don't have. Most clergy have like a working knowledge of Greek and maybe even Hebrew, but most of them are out of practice in it, if that makes sense. And a lot of clergy don't even have any knowledge of biblical languages at all. So, for better or worse, if we're going to use the Bible in our daily devotional lives, it has to be in the vernacular. It makes no sense to try to use something in your devotional life that you can't understand. So, we do need translations. Now, here's the thing though, Bible selling is a big business. And so while we do need translations, we do also need to be aware that there's a lot of translations. And the reason for that is partially just because the Bible is actually the most purchased book in the world by far. Ironically, it's also the most stolen book in the world by far. Um, and the most given away book in the world by far, but it is the best selling book in human history by a landslide. And so, because of that, producing Bibles is a huge industry. So, I call it the Bible selling industrial complex. And I am thoroughly guilty of that as a bookstore owner. I am 100% involved in the Bible selling industrial complex. And I can tell you that selling Bibles is a huge part of what's kept our bookstore in business. But another reason why there are so many Bible versions is actually because of copyright laws. And the reason why that is true is because every Christian publication creates their own Bible version. Or, I mean, like every Christian publishing house is going to create their own Bible version so that their authors can use that Bible version, and then their books don't have to pay any royalties to some other publishing house for using their Bible version. So that's why, and that's also why a lot of times you'll see like these really solid Christian writers who are really conservative and they're quoting from like some paraphrase Bible. It's because when they wrote the book, they were using whatever Bible they use in their devotional life, probably an ESV or Holman or something like that. But then when they went to publish the book, they got picked up by the publisher of, say, the New Living Translation or something. And so the publishing house was like, hey, we're going to use our Bible and then not pay any royalties. So that's how that comes about. So that's also a factor is, you want to be able to publish other books and quote the Bible, but you don't want to pay for those quotes. So you publish your own Bible. And so in that sense, not only is selling your Bible a big business, but even more so, even if you never sold any copies, the amount of money you're saving by publishing all these books using your Bible is huge. The result, though, is that thanks in part to capitalism, there's an overwhelming number of Bible translations. If you visit your local bookstore, hopefully visit your local Christian bookstore, you'll just see lots of different Bibles, and it can be difficult to know which translation should I go with, which translation should I choose. Father Stephen says on page 81, every translation is an interpretation. There is a tendency to think, based on experience with dictionaries, that a word in one language equals a word in another language, such that all languages essentially parallel one another. This, however, is simply not the case, especially when speaking about ancient languages in comparison to a modern language. In Hebrew, for example, there is no system of verb tenses parallel to those in English. In classical Greek, there is no indefinite article, such as a or an. And what is called the definite article in Greek is actually more like a demonstrative pronoun, such as this or that. Countless other examples are possible. So, in other words, there can never be a one-to-one translation. You'll never see a perfect translation because all translation requires interpretation. And that's actually okay, especially for us, because since we have tradition, we have the understanding of the text isn't just dependent on us understanding a particular text. Like, we have the whole tradition to help guide our interpretation of the text. So it's actually okay. But with that said, I know this is a really difficult point for a lot of people, because a lot of people feel that if you're saying that there's no way to perfectly translate, then that means that they don't have the Bible. That's not true. But it does mean that you don't have, like, you aren't understanding the Bible as well as somebody who speaks Koine Greek would understand the Bible if they read it in Koine Greek. And that should be obvious to us, which is why it's awesome being Orthodox, because, the Greeks are Orthodox. So clearly we're right. That said, this brings us to the topic of what language actually is. Language is essentially describing things, concepts, and actions. And so to understand a language is to be able to hear and or read that language and discern the things, actions, and concepts being described by the language. Which means that what a translation is being able to understand those things, ideas, whatever, in one language, and then also be able to then relate that back in another language. This may seem obvious, but in application, it is anything but obvious. And I say that because when we come to translating the Bible, the debate that gets raised is whether to translate the Bible what's called literally, or whether to translate the Bible what they call conceptually, meaning, are we basically the question is, are we going to convey the sort of word for word exactly what the Bible says in its original language and just try to sort of paste that into a new language? Or are we trying to convey concepts and ideas? And typically this debate runs something like either being totally literal or being totally conceptual and ignoring the literal. So an extreme example of this playing out is the Women's Bible, which was produced by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was an atheist who hated God, hated Christianity. Sorry, not an atheist, because I guess she was like a spiritist or whatever. But she hated Christianity, and because she hated Christianity, she got a group of scholars together, and basically all of them were atheists and spiritists and people who hated Christianity. And she said, I hate Christianity, but we'll never destroy Christianity. We have to change Christianity. In order to change Christianity, we need to change the Bible. So this group of scholars made a Bible translation in which they intentionally removed any reference to the patriarchy, intentionally removed any masculine titles for God. So I guess in that way it was the first ever inclusive Bible, because it removed masculine pronouns. But with that said, I think it's really easy to see the problem with such a blatant paraphrase, but we miss the problem, or maybe we don't, but a lot of people miss the problem when it's something less blatant, or worse, when a translation meshes with our personal biases. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. We're going to talk about some translations that have biases woven into the text, and we're going to see why that's a problem. I'm going to include a shameless plug that Rachel Wilson, who's an Orthodox Christian, has an excellent book called Occult Feminism. And if you want to be part of rebuilding what Elizabeth Cady Stanton and her ilk have attacked and tried to destroy, I highly recommend purchasing Occult Feminism, The Secret History of Women's Liberation by Rachel Wilson. And she actually has a section in that book about the women's Bible and basically refuting it. Now, I mentioned biases. Another interesting example of biases is what's called study Bibles. So, for example, the Orthodox Study Bible. And these are more clear about what their kind of bias is, what perspective they're coming from. They're usually aimed at a particular audience, like, say, the Geneva Bible was aimed at Reformed evangelical types, and they might have commentary from a particular teacher, or the Orthodox Bible has commentary from the Church Fathers. But like the MacArthur Study Bible has commentary from John MacArthur. And in fact, he got into a little bit of trouble for his commentary having, in Galatians, it actually contains basically adoptionism in his commentary. So really problematic. But he's since then repudiated that. So, but anyway, it's just interesting that you're writing a Bible commentary, and you have, because he always and MacArthur fans always tout, like, oh, he's got 30 years teaching the Bible, or 60 years teaching the Bible, or whatever. And I'm going, yeah, but his earliest Bible commentary, he's teaching literal heresy, like a literal condemned heresy. And so his 30 years of experience mean nothing if he's teaching actual heresy as part of this. But anyway, rarely do these study Bibles admit or explain the biases within the translations themselves. So even these study Bibles, as helpful as they are and as useful as they often don't address the biases present in the text that they are commenting on. On page 82, Father Stephen says, the purpose of this chapter then is to discuss the various methodologies that are used in the translation of the biblical text. English Bibles can be grouped into categories based on these different approaches to translation. The first important factor to understand in selecting a Bible is the degree to which this particular version is attempting to reflect the original text or to provide a particular interpretation of it. This chapter will then discuss the history and methodology of a number of major popular English translations and their relative value for Orthodox Christians who are interested in reading the scriptures for themselves. In this respect, the list will be in no way exhaustive, as new versions and revisions go in and out of print with regularity. Rather, it will describe the major traditions and families of the English Bible that the Orthodox Christian will most commonly encounter. So first off, I would say that, to understand these differences, the first thing we should know is that there's different base texts. And what that means is in order to translate something, they have to have something to translate. And as we talked about, I think actually 2 or 3 weeks ago now, that there's different families of text. Maybe that was actually just last week. There's different families, there's these different sort of traditions of the text. So you have to choose which of those is going to be your primary source that you're translating from. And so to understand more about that, go and watch our last two things. But the Old Testament base text, I won't labor the point too much, but generally translators use the Masoretic text as their primary text. We talked about last week we talked about 2 weeks ago why that's not necessary and why that's not necessarily the best text to use. I think that those who are using the Masoretic text should have to label their text as a translation of the Masoretic text, rather than what they do is label it as a translation of the Old Testament. Whereas when you make a translation of the Septuagint, you have to label it as a translation of the Septuagint. I think that's wrong because the Septuagint, as we talked about 2 weeks ago, is no less the Old Testament than the Masoretic text is. That said, there are some translation committees and some translations that use the Greek Septuagint as their primary text. The Orthodox Study Bible is a good example. The Orthodox Study Bible uses the Septuagint as its primary text for the Old Testament. Any translation that's not using the Masoretic text names its base text. So for that reason, if you see a Bible that doesn't name its base text of the Old Testament, it's using the Masoretic text in all likelihood. Now for the New Testament base text, you have different philosophies that come into play. Father Stephen does a pretty good job explaining the differences in these philosophies. I'm not going to get into that too much because it's just a lot of material and it'll get us pretty far into the weeds. And to be honest, I think other than me, who gets really excited reading stuff like this, I think most people find it a little bit boring and tedious. And so for a book club, it's probably not the best thing for us to go through. But in the book, he does a really good job of explaining the New Testament base text and the different philosophies. But one thing that's important to note is that every English Bible uses, to a greater or lesser extent, what's called the eclectic text. The eclectic text means that it's taking into account lots of different manuscripts. It's not just going to be a translation of just one manuscript. And yes, that even applies to the King James Version of the Bible. I know that a lot of King James only folks like to present it as though the King James Version has just one text that it's going to. That's not true. The King James Version used textual critical examination to the best of their ability as well. But Father Stephen explains different variations, so read that on your own. The important thing for our purposes is to understand that for any translation that you're going to buy, for any translation that you're going to use to study, the first thing you need to know is have some idea of what their philosophy is with regard to the text they're translating. So the two philosophies, broadly speaking, are either to have a preference for the older sources or a preference for the majority text. I should say two of the examples. There's other methods, but these are good examples that give you a good idea of what these methods are like. So Some translations give deference to the oldest manuscripts we have, say anything from the 2nd to the 5th century, and then they'll still use the eclectic text and they'll still draw influence from later sources, but they don't give them as much credence as they do the earliest sources. Some translations have the direct opposite philosophy. Their philosophy is to use the majority text, meaning that the majority of all of their all of the manuscripts, they take whatever the reading is in the majority of those texts, irrespective of what time period those texts came from. It's basically kind of giving every manuscript a vote. Again, neither method is perfect, neither method is wrong either. There's definitely things you could point out about both of these different styles, and then there are other methods too, like I said. Now, on page 89, Father Stephen says, in addition to working from different base texts, English translations of the Bible also follow various strategies or theories of translation. While there are a handful of biblical translations produced by a single person, the most well-known, popular, and commonly encountered English versions of the scriptures were translated by committees, especially in recent times. These committees have grown increasingly diverse. This is most often a good thing, as diverse translation committees help to prevent a sectarian bias from intruding. In addition, this diversity has, in several more recent translations, led to the presence and therefore influence of Orthodox Christians in these committees. So committees are generally a good thing. More importantly, though, translations just by an individual are never going to be quite as good. A really famous example would be William Tyndale's Bible translation. And Ryken actually has a really good book where he examines different Bible translations. If you really want to go in depth on this, I highly recommend Ryken's book on English translations. That's one of my favorite nerdy books to read. But with that said, he talks about William Tyndale's translation, and while Ryken greatly respects William Tyndale, he does admit that it's just not a very good translation. One of my favorite examples that I like to joke around with my wife is in William Tyndale's translation of Genesis chapter 3, when the snake runs across Eve, he says to her in the Bible you're probably familiar with, it says something to the effect of, hath God truly said that you cannot eat of any tree in the garden? Well, in the William Tyndale version, it says, tush, be still. Hath God said that you cannot eat from any tree in the garden? I think you can see the problematicness of that. But that's the thing, is when you're just some guy translating the Bible, some guy with a high IQ and a polyglot Bible knowledge, you can just translate it to say whatever you want, and that's extremely problematic. And also, William Tyndale's Bible translation contains lots of heresy that he puts into the text. He adds words in places to make texts more favorable to his Protestant leanings, and he takes words out of other places to make texts less unfavorable. So, for example, in his translation of Romans 3, he adds the word alone, so that it says that instead of saying a man is justified by faith apart from works of the law, his Bible says a man is justified by faith alone apart from works. Well, that's not what the text says. But William Tyndale's Bible does say that. And actually, the Luther Bible does the same thing. I actually have a Luther Bible at home. It does the same thing, but in German. But, this is a good reason why we should have committees and not just individuals translating the Bible, because even if, that gives us things that we have to wrestle with, it's better to wrestle with what a text actually says than to make it say something that it doesn't. So yeah, and I would just say that any theological tradition that isn't willing to wrestle with what the text actually says and instead has to try to change it is not a theological tradition that you want to be a part of. So on page 89 again, Father Stephen says, a variety of motives have moved the formation of these committees to produce new translations of the scriptures and to update existing ones. Some of these motives, such as concern over the sectarian nature of existing translations or the desire to take into account new textual discoveries, are laudatory. Others are more mercenary. The current proliferation of English versions in the US, for example, is motivated largely by the desire of major publishing companies to be able to license their own versions of the scriptures. But to paraphrase St. Paul, whether for good motives or for ill, the scriptures continue to be translated. So, yeah, whether, there's good and bad in everything, and there's good and bad motives in it, but the upshot is we continue to get more Bibles, and we continue to get better Bibles too. So this is a good thing. And this is also a good reason why it's actually good to have multiple translations of the Bible if you can. If you can have it, it's good to have so that you can cross-check different things when you're studying and when you're being studious. People tease Cheryl and I for this a lot because we have a whole shelf full of just Bibles, of various kinds of Bibles, and I think in addition to that shelf, I also have a few Bibles that I have set aside that I use for actually reading regularly. So, so we have a lot of Bibles, and my mom teases us sometimes. She says, like, how many Bibles do you need? It's the same book. But they tease us now, but someday when we're great in the kingdom and all the saints rise up and call us blessed, they won't be teasing us then. No, I'm just kidding. But there is something to be said for having multiple translations. Maybe you won't be as extreme and radical as Cheryl and I happen to be, but if you have the ability to do so and the desire to do so, it's good to have multiple translations, because reading just one translation is kind of like having one favorite Bible teacher that you listen to all the time on YouTube. You may be inadvertently learning some errors along with the truth because you're only getting Christianity from one source. You're not getting sort of a broader perspective given to you. Obviously, there's only so much you can do, and all of us are going to have our favored source, and all of us should. Your local priest should be your favorite Bible teacher, period. That said, we're all going to have preferences. We're all going to have different biases, and that's okay. But reading from multiple versions allows you to get a feel for different interpretations that are going into the text. And again, that's not for everyone. It's okay, but to those to whom it is given, that's definitely good. That said, the difference in translation philosophy ultimately comes down to two different types of translations. There's what's called formal equivalence translations, which are literal word for word translations, and they bring you closer to the original text. This often sacrifices readability. So, for example, in English, there's a Bible called the New American Standard Bible, which is probably the furthest in the formal equivalence category. And there's a lot of places where that Bible is not particularly readable. And frankly, I would never use the NASB for the Psalms because the poetic nature of the Psalms is totally lost because you're translating, in Hebrew it's poetry, but it doesn't translate as poetry if you go that formal equivalence. So that sacrifice is made there. On the other hand, you have dynamic equivalents or dynamic translations, and these focus on readability, but sometimes, and so they bring you closer to the sense and meaning of the text, kind of, but in your own language. That said, it often takes you one step further away from the text itself and makes it so that those biases that we were talking about before creep in more readily. So it's honestly good if you can, especially if you're a scholar, it's good to have both types of translations at your disposal. That said, again, I know not everybody's going to do that, and if you can only have one or the other, go for something a little bit more formal equivalence. So then there is a third category, but it's not a category I would recommend, and that's paraphrases. Paraphrases like the New Living Translation or the Message, the Amplified Bible, any of these are very readable, but pretty much 100% biased. In fact, they really barely even maintain the message of the Bible. And realistically, these have no value and shouldn't be used by Orthodox Christians. The more obscured the text becomes, the less of a translation it is, and the more of a paraphrase it is. Now, aside from that, once again, we have the concept of paraphrases, study Bibles. Study Bibles are awesome, and I have lots and lots of study Bibles. And what study Bibles do is they contain notes from committees or theologians. My favorite is obviously the Orthodox Study Bible. The Orthodox Study Bible is really great because all of the notes are from the Church Fathers. So you really can't get any better than that. But most study Bibles, most of the ones that I have, come from an evangelical background and are generally useful. But, other than the Orthodox Study Bible, there's not really any study Bibles that I think are going to be, where you can just take it in and absorb it and be totally able to get nothing but good from it. Because their biases are not necessarily going to be useful. And even with the Orthodox Study Bible, sometimes there can be a downside that the study notes can become kind of a crutch where you're not being formed by the scriptures anymore. You're kind of being formed now by the study Bible itself. Like you're not really wrestling through passages on your own because you're just taking whatever the study notes say and being like, okay, this is what I believe now. So that can become kind of a crutch. That's the only real downside, though. The upsides are that it's extremely helpful in understanding and in deepening your ability to understand and exegete the text, and in bridging the gap between us and the people who were present. So, and again, I think this goes back in some ways to our first or second week when we talked about the fact that the scriptures were not given as just a book to be read. The scriptures were given as in a liturgical context, and were given with someone who was there to explain them to the person. So the epistles were not written just to be read by themselves. They were written to be read aloud to people and then interpreted to people. So, study Bibles help to bridge that gap and help to fill in that blank space for us 2,000 years later. And that's why I think everybody should be using study Bibles, particularly the Orthodox study Bible, because it's the best one I've found and because it's Orthodox. But even if you're not going to do the Orthodox study Bible, I would say at least get like a good evangelical study Bible or something, because I do think that they're just so much better. So now, going from there, we get into the major versions of the Bible. The most popular Bible to this day is the King James Version. You really can't approach this topic without talking about the King James Version. It's just literally a masterpiece. It is just the most beautiful, possibly the most beautiful English text of all time. The original King James Version was made in 1611. The authorized version, you can still find some 1611 King James Bibles, but they're actually pretty rare. So all the people who say that they're King James onlyist and that you have to use the 1611 Bible, they aren't using the 1611 Bible. I hate to burst people's bubble, but the version we're actually familiar with is the 1769 Oxford edition, which unfortunately is the edition that does not have all of the books. The original King James Version of the Bible did have all of the books. So if you really want to be a King James Version onlyist, you've got to have the full canon, and you got to go back to the source. But that said, again, even the 1769 King James Bible is extremely beautiful. And so I can't plug it enough. I think it's truly an awesome Bible translation. It's Andrew Stephen Damick's favorite Bible translation. So, what more do I have to say? Now, if you want it to be a little bit more readable, what do we have here? Oh, Josh found it. He found the 1611. Look at that. Gotta show people. There you go. So you can get a real, genuine 1611 Bible at that website. $80. There you go. Now, there's also the New King James Version. And basically what the New King James Version is it uses the same base text. And it also maintains the quote-unquote peculiarities. In other words, it doesn't. So most modern versions, there's lots of Bible verses that are not, lots of verses that are represented in the manuscript that was used for the King James Version that are not found in some of the manuscripts that we have now. There's different reasons for that, but a lot of modern translations interpret that to mean that it's not part of the so-called original text. And because they interpret it to mean that, they have removed those verses from their translation. The New King James Version put those verses back so that you have everything that was in the King James Version. And they're, it's a different translation philosophy. It tries to be more faithful to the translation philosophy that went into the King James Version. Before the King James Version, though, there was a version called the Geneva Bible. You really never see the Geneva Bible anymore. But the Geneva Bible was one of the early examples, at least within Protestantism, of a commentary Bible. And it kind of set the stage for a lot of the study Bibles that we have today, actually. But the Geneva Bible was very Calvinist and also anti-monarchist, so boo. But that's actually why the King James Version came about, was because the Geneva Bible was so popular in England, and King James didn't like that it was Calvinist and anti-monarchist, so he wisely had them create a Bible that wouldn't be terrible. And what we got for it was the beautiful King James Version. The RSV, or Revised Standard Version, is actually the successor of the King James Version, and is also notable to us for being the first ever translation to have Orthodox Christians on their translation committee. It's also the first Bible to use the word "the Lord" instead of the term Jehovah, which the term Jehovah is, well, there's a whole history behind the term Jehovah, so I won't get into that. We can get into it. Lutheran Satire has a funny video about the word Jehovah if you want to understand it from the perspective of two goofy Irish peasants. But but that's a good one. Then there was the New International Version, or NIV, which is extremely liberal in its translation philosophy and frankly borders on being a paraphrase itself. And much like the Geneva Bible, is extremely Calvinistic in its leanings. It was actually put out by the Dutch Reformed Church and is really just a paraphrase, but very heavily Calvinistic. Then there's the New Revised Standard Version. The New Revised Standard Version is famous for being the first Bible to add gender inclusive language. So, ew. But just not a very good Bible translation. In response to the New Revised Standard Version, in the 1990s, conservative scholars came together and wanted a Bible that would continue the tradition of the Revised Standard Version and would basically be a revision of the Revised Standard Version, but would be, I think, if I remember correctly, the first Bible translation to use the Dead Sea Scrolls as part of its translation. And that was the English Standard Version. So the English Standard Version is really a revision of the Revised Standard Version, but makes use of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is really cool, and represents the most, basically, to date, one of the most accurate as far as formal equivalence translations goes, but without sacrificing readability. So the English Standard Version has really become the most frequently used Bible version by theologians and scholars today. And a result, is the most frequently used by Protestant pastors. And there's a version of the English Standard Bible that has the Deuterocanon, the 7 books from the Catholic Bible. Unfortunately, there's still no English Standard Version that has all of the books in the Orthodox Bible. But you can get one that at least has the 7 books that Catholics have preserved that Protestants haven't. But you can't get one that has all the books. There's also the New American Standard Bible, and I promise I'm almost done. This is the furthest into dynamic equivalence. It's helpful for study, but it's really not very good for devotional life. So I don't recommend it for Orthodox Christians for that reason. Because as I've hopefully labored by this point, we do not see the Bible as a book that you just pick up and study to be a scholar or whatever. We see the Bible as a book that is there for our edification. It's there for our devotional life and our devotional practice. So because of that, I really don't think the NASB is a very good Bible. For all the Bibles that I own, I think the NASB might be the only version that I actually don't own. I used to have one, but I think I got rid of it because it's just not useful for your devotional life. There's also the NET, which I forget what the E is, but that has the most copious notes and is the best Bible if you're interested in learning about textual criticism easily, because it has really copious notes about why they went with each reading that they did, why they include whatever, don't include whatever. So I guess, again, the big takeaway is don't use paraphrases. Don't, not the NLT, not the Message, not the Amplified Bible. These aren't really useful. Don't use blatantly sectarian versions of the Bible, like the New World Translation put out by the Watchtower Society, which is Jehovah's Witnesses. And frankly, that's not even a translation. It's literally just a revision of the King James Version where they tried to take away everything Christian from it. So totally useless. Don't use the Joseph Smith translation, which again is not a translation. It's just Joseph Smith taking the King James Bible and adding Mormon garbage to it. The Clear Word Bible is basically the Seventh-day Adventist version of the Watchtower, the New World Bible. So, don't use the Clear Word Bible because it's just horrible. Yeah, it's just not very clear. It's the Obscured Word Bible. But I would even say don't use the NIV, the New International Version. I would say don't do it because, to be honest, versions like that are so incredibly motivated by sectarian, in that case Calvinistic lenses, to where the translator's bias is so thoroughly ingrained into the text. I honestly think, I still think that the NIV, I'm not saying that if the NIV is the Bible you're using, then you're not a Christian. Obviously, the NIV is still going to give you the words of Christ, and so it's not as bad as the New World Translation or anything like that. But I just think that ultimately you're going to be stunting your growth by inculcating these harmful ideas in with truth. But at the end of the day, the best Bible is the one you'll read with all those caveats in place. I guess the only thing I can really say is do your best to be a student of the Word in your life and in your practice. and go out and read the Bible, and hopefully try to live it out too. So share this with your friends so that they too can be freed indeed. And I'll see you next time. God bless.